Welcome everyone to our Be a Pollineighbor presentation. Before we begin, here are some of our sponsors. And we also have a quick video from Mayor Jody Gondek.
Welcome to the 33rd Annual Mayor's Environment Expo. As we come together from around
Oh, Leah, it's Lindsay. The video's just paused if you wanted to restart it, and then you have to be careful not to click anywhere else on your screen.
That the Calgary area, where the Bow and Elbow Rivers meet, is a place of confluence, where the sharing of ideas and opportunities naturally come together. Indigenous people were the original caretakers of this land and the first champions of environmental conservation. This land is a home that we all share. And it's vitally important that we protect our home, our environment, by working together. What drives my optimism is seeing the innovation and commitment to climate action from all of you, our students. I will continue to amplify youth voices on the climate crisis, and I look forward to hearing your ideas. I hope this session sparks conversations and encourages all of us to take greater action in protecting our environment. Thank you all for participating.
Good morning, everyone. It's lovely to gather with all of you today. My name is Chelsea, and I'm here with my friend Leah. Maybe we'll take a look at her. And we are both educators here at Calgary Parks. So Leah and I are here at the Inglewood Bird Sanctuary, which is a lovely place. It's just a little bit downstream of the place where the Bow and the Elbow Rivers meet. And we're lucky to be here in Calgary, but Calgary is actually the youngest name for this place. And there are other older names given to our city by Indigenous people who've lived here since time immemorial. So we are gathered on the traditional territory of the Niitsitapi, also known as the Blackfoot Confederacy. And the groups that are part of that confederacy are the Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani nations. And their name for this part of the world is Mohkinstsis. But there's other names as well. So this is also the traditional territory of the Îyârhe Nakoda, or Stoney Nakoda nations. And the groups that are part of that are the Wesley, Bearspaw, and Chiniki nations. And their name for this place is Wishishpa. This is also home to the Tsuut'ina Nation, whose traditional territory is also here, and their name for this place is Gutsitsu. And it's also the traditional homeland of the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3, and their name for this place is Otasqueñe. What I love about these names is not just how beautiful they are and how different they sound, but they all have a shared meaning. They all refer to the Elbow River, which is one of the rivers that flows through Calgary. And our identity as a city is really tied to the landscape here. That water that gives us water to drink, that gives us life, and gives water to all the plants that grow here. And so today we'll be talking a little bit more, not about our rivers, but about our small relations, our pollinator friends who help those plants too. They help those plants to make seeds, and they make fruits that we enjoy eating. So I'll pass things over to Leah, who can tell us a little bit more about what pollinators are.
So let's start with a big question. What is a pollinator? A pollinator is a big word, but it means something pretty simple. A pollinator is a critter that moves pollen between flowers. Now in the bottom photo, you can see a bumblebee on a plant with kind of a funny name. It's called curly cup gumweed. The yellow parts in the middle of the flower are the pollen. Maybe you've smelled a flower before and gotten pollen on your nose. But here in Calgary, most of our pollinators are insects. So I want every group here to take a moment to think of a pollinator while we transition over to Chelsea for a demo.
Yeah, so while you're answering about what your pollinator ideas are, Cody might respond in the Q&A. He is one of our program coordinators here at Calgary Parks, so he's not just a stranger in the chat. You can chat with him about what your ideas are. But as Leah said, some of our flowers have yellow parts in the middle, and those yellow parts are full of pollen. And for these flowers to make seeds or make new flowers, they need to move that pollen from one flower to another flower. But that's a lot of trouble for a plant that doesn't have legs to move around. So what they do is they are able to give a little bit some nectar to some of our pollinators. So our pollinators are just looking for nectar to eat, mostly. They're looking for nectar, and so they're going from flower to flower, drinking some of that nectar. But as they move from flower to flower, they get pollen all over their bodies. And that pollen moves from flower to flower, and it helps those flowers to make their seeds. Now, this is really important because once a seed is planted in the ground, what comes up? More flowers. So those flowers are able to make new generations because of this help that the pollinators give them. But it's also really nice for people like you and me who like to eat fruits. So if you like strawberries or peaches or plums, you like things that pollinators help with. And I know that my favorite fruit is an apple, and they definitely need pollinators to help out. Leah, what's your favorite fruit?
Oh, my favorite fruit is cherries. They definitely need pollinators to help them out. So let's take a look at a few of those pollinators. There are a lot of different animals that are pollinators here in Calgary. And you named a few of them a minute ago, but this slide shows you some examples of different types that you might see in your backyard, your schoolyard, or in a city park this summer. So in the top row, we have something called a hummingbird clearwing moth. Now don't get confused, this is not a hummingbird. It's a giant moth and it likes to forage during the day. So you might think it's a hummingbird, but it's pretty cool. It's a big moth. The next one is a red-belted bumblebee. We have some yellow sulfur butterflies. The bottom row, there's our hummingbird. This is the calliope hummingbird. We have a leafcutter bee and a sweat bee. Now, other insects like beetles and flies and ants are also pollinators here in Calgary. Now, there are over 20,000 species of bees worldwide. And here in Calgary, we have over 300 types of bees. Our local wild bees are very different than honeybees. Now, honeybees come from a whole nother continent. They come from Europe, and they live in man-made hives with people, beekeepers, that take care of them. Now, the wild bees that we have here in Calgary come in all shapes and sizes. Some are large and fuzzy like bumblebees, while others are tiny and metallic blue or green. They almost look like just a little fly. Now, some people are surprised to learn that 70% of our native bees make their homes in the ground, while others nest in tunnels or cavities. So our native bees are very gentle. Many of them are solitary, meaning they love to live alone. And they don't swarm because they don't have a hive to protect, unlike our honeybees. Some of these native bees, or most of them, very rarely sting, but the neat thing is that some of them don't even have stingers, so it's not even possible for them to sting you.
Okay, as Leah said, most of the bees in Alberta are solitary bees, and most of them don't even look like bees. But even though they don't look like bees, they're still some of our most important pollinators. Solitary bee females, so the girl bees, they'll make their nests in tunnels or cavities, sometimes in old trees or hollow plant stems, or even in bee hotels that people made. So if you look on the slide in the bottom right photo, there's a hollow plant stem that could be a sunflower. So when a sunflower stem is cut open, it sort of looks like this. So hollow stems like this are the homes of tiny solitary bees. It's the perfect cozy nest for them. And so I'll do a little demonstration so we can see how this looks like up close. We will take a look. We'll move from the slide. Okay, so solitary bees will lay their eggs late in the summer, and they go through a process over the winter called metamorphosis. But that's a big science word. Maybe we say that all together. Metamorphosis. And metamorphosis means change, shape, process. And so it means that these bees transform over the winter into a new version of themselves. So in honor of these bees, I'm going to transform into a female solitary bee. And I'm going to choose a place to nest. But first I have to look for a good nesting site. Maybe I'll look under here. I think I found one. I found a perfect nest site for me. I think I'll fit right in there. So I have a nesting spot where I can kind of crawl inside this nice hollow stem. And when I'm inside, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to crawl to the end and lay an egg. So I've laid my egg inside, but when this egg hatches, it needs something to eat. So I'm going to collect a little snack pack of nectar and pollen and leave it right beside my egg so they have something to eat after they're hatching. And now different kinds of solitary bees do this a little differently. So there's a certain kind of solitary bee called a leaf cutter bee. They do just what they say. So they do things like this. They'll cut holes in leaves. These are some Saskatoon leaves that had some holes cut in them by some leaf cutter bees. And so these leaf cutter bees will cut some leaves with their mouth, and they'll fold them or block them up so that they're at the end of their nest cavity there. Okay, but they're not the only kind of bee that has nests and chambers like this. There's another kind of bee called a mason bee, and they like to block off with mud. So they'll take a mouthful of mud, and then they'll make a block at the end of those chambers with mud instead of with leaves. But although these bees do things a little differently, it doesn't really matter what kind of bee you are. You'll keep on laying eggs and leaving little snack packs and making little chambers until you're all the way done your nest. So they'll keep on building. And then when it's time for those eggs to hatch, they hatch into something that looks like this. So this is an example of what a larva would look like. So the larva is the next stage in their life cycle. So they go from egg to larva. And that larva is hungry. So they will eat everything that's left behind by their bee mom. So all that snack pack, they'll eat it until they're really, really full. And then when they're really full and enough time has passed, they'll make a cocoon around themselves. So we sometimes think of cocoons as belonging to moths or chrysalises for butterflies, but bees do a similar thing. They'll make a cocoon around themselves and they'll kind of stay in a rest mode for a while they change and grow. And we call this stage of their life pupa. They go from egg to larva to pupa, and this is sort of what they look like inside their cocoon. And then when they're all done their rest phase and the winter has passed, they'll hatch out as adult bees in the springtime. And so that's kind of how they look when they come out of their nest chamber. And they're all ready to pollinate all those fruit trees that you see. If you have a fruit tree in your yard, you might see a lot of these bees because they're very important early season pollinators. So I will transform back and we can go back to the slide to take another look at some of those bees on the screen. Oh, okay. So we see a sweat bee, which is the bee on the white flower there. And sweat bees will make their nests in loose soil or underground tunnels. Sometimes they'll even use rotting wood to make their nests. And those bees will make things a little different. But the ones on the right, the leaf cutter bee, the one on the purple flower there, that's the one I was talking about that cut up that Saskatoon leaf and use those leaf pieces to make those chambers of their nest cavity. So I will pass things on. We're going to move to the next slide where Leah will tell us more about social bees.
Thanks, Chelsea. That was a great description of our solitary bees living alone and laying their eggs in late summer. But bumblebees are what we call social bees. They live in colonies that each have a queen. And we're going to take a moment to imagine what it's like to be a queen bumblebee. Now feel free to do some actions where you're sitting that go along with the story. So imagine waking up in a little burrow. It's a bit chilly. You're feeling kind of hungry. So you climb out into a sunny spot and vibrate your wing muscles to help warm you up. It's kind of like a shiver. Ooh. It's a good thing you have such a fuzzy body because it is a cool spring morning. Once you've warmed up enough, you'll take flight and start to search for flowers. Now there aren't many around, so when you find one, you take a big drink of nectar. Maybe you even snack on some pollen, while more pollen sticks to your fuzzy belly. Now as the days warm up, you start to find more and more flowers and decide it's time to make a nest. After looking around, you find an old ground squirrel burrow. That will work perfectly. You collect lots of nectar and pollen in the baskets on your legs, kind of like cargo pants, and build little wax pots to keep it in. You then lay some eggs that will become your workers. You stay with these eggs because you need to keep them warm until they hatch. But once they've hatched, the new bees will fly off in search of food and bring food back to you. It's like your own personal skip the dishes. Now this is the life. You get to be the nest potato, and eat food and raise baby bees. Your workers tend to only live for about a month, so you need to keep making more until the end of summer comes near. At this point, you need to make a plan. You know you won't survive another winter, but you want to make some bees who can. It's time to make some new queens. You will also make some male bees to go mate with the new queens, with other new queens. Now, once this next generation of queens emerges, they are typical teenagers. They sit in the nest and they eat all the food, but they're trying to get ready for winter. And then when they're ready, they'll go off and they'll find a mate. Now, once these new queens have mated, do you know what happens to the male bees? Well, sorry boys, but at the ripe old age of 2 weeks old, they die. And this is also the time for the dramatic death of the queen. But also, because our male bees only live for a couple weeks, that means that most of the bumblebees that you see throughout the summertime are likely to be female bees. So the only bees to live on to hibernate through the winter are these new queens. And as bumblebees, you're lucky to be able to stay out longer in the fall, longer than most other insects. Again, that fuzzy body comes in handy. But eventually, there aren't many flowers left, and the nights are getting quite cold, so the new queens settle in for a winter's sleep, ready to begin the cycle again the next spring. Good work, bees! Bumblebees love Calgary. here in Calgary, we may have more different kinds of bumblebees than anywhere else in North America. We have 19 different kinds of bumblebees that call Calgary home. Now, on the slide here, we can see a few of them. On the top row, we have a cryptic bumblebee. And we also have this really big bumblebee. So if you ever see a bumblebee that's just huge flying around, it's probably this one. It's a Nevada bumblebee. On the bottom row, we have a Hunt's bumblebee and an endangered bumblebee found here in Calgary called the Gypsy Cuckoo bumblebee. Well, now that we know more about some of our pollinator friends, let's think about why we need them around. Why are pollinators so important? Well, the thing is, many of the plants that we eat need pollinators to reproduce. It's estimated that insects pollinate a third of the plants that we rely on for food. Pollinators also provide people with building material in the form of trees and lumber, as well as medicine in the form of bee venom. Without pollinators, many of our trees and plants would not be able to make seeds, resulting in less habitat for wildlife, fewer natural resources like forests, and fewer plants. Now, flowering plants produce the oxygen humans and other animals breathe, and they absorb carbon dioxide in the environment. Plants have the superpower of cleaning our water and preventing soil erosion. So, without pollinators to help our plants reproduce, the quality of our air, water, and soil would greatly decrease. That is a lot of responsibility for these little creatures. Knowing how important they are, we should do as much as we can to help them out, don't you think? Well, on that note, did you know that you live in a bee city? In 2019, Calgary was declared Canada's 36th bee city. And what this means is that the city of Calgary is committed to providing food and homes for local bees and other pollinators. We do this by adding local wildflowers, trees and shrubs to our parks and green spaces, installing bee hotels, and making sure our parks have special areas for bees to spend the winter, like hollow plant stems, areas of loose soil, and old rotting logs. Now, the city of Calgary has completed over 250 projects that add native trees, shrubs, and wildflowers to our parks and green spaces. We try hard to recycle materials and reuse them. So for example, if a tree has to be removed or it falls over in a windstorm, we might reuse that old trunk in another park as an area for bees to nest and overwinter in. Now this slide shows a green space in our city that's been transformed into a bee-friendly area that we call the Bee Boulevard. It's located along Canyon Meadows Drive between Bow Bottom Trail and McLeod Trail. So this area, it used to be full of long grasses and weeds, and every year it had to be mowed many times. And the weeds had to be killed using chemical weed killer, which is good for killing weeds, but can be very harmful for pollinators. So in 2019, the city began to work with several different partners, and we transformed this area into a bee oasis. There are now bee hotels, there's sandstone plant beds, there's nesting places for solitary bees, there's fields of local wildflowers and shrubs, and a number of bumblebee houses. So this is what we're doing here in our parks and green spaces, but the majority of our city's land is covered with houses and schools, which means pollinators need help from citizens and schools too. They need pollineighbors. So what can we do to help? What can you do to help? We encourage you to take a moment after the presentation to discuss this as a group. There are so many simple ways we can help pollinators right in our backyards and communities. So here are some of our suggestions. You can help and observe pollinators in your area by planting fruit, planting vegetables and wildflowers at your home, at your community garden, even at your school. So when choosing which flowers to plant, consider wildflowers with different colors and different flower shapes. This way, more pollinators can enjoy your garden. So for example, different bees actually have different tongue lengths. So some bees with short tongues, they pollinate flowers that are shallow or flat, whereas bees with long tongues can reach the pollen and nectar in blooms that are very deep or tube-shaped. Also, one pollinator might like the taste of one type of flower over another, while other pollinators like them all. So pollinators work from early spring to late fall, so it's smart to choose plants with a variety of shapes and colors that also bloom at different types of year. So here are some great examples of plants that attract pollinators and can be easily grown here in Calgary. So on the left-hand side, there's this beautiful plant called Blazing Star. In the middle, we have Golden Bean, also known as Buffalo Bean. Those have been blooming here in Calgary for the last month or so, so a nice early plant. We also have Yellow Prairie Coneflower and Yarrow, which should be blooming soon. And we have Purple Prairie Coneflower. We have many more examples of native wildflowers on our website as well. The native plants, they are local plants. They're not introduced from another country. They've always been here. So these are the kinds of plants that you would have seen here in Calgary before there was even a city here. There were entire meadows of wildflowers, like a big buffet for pollinators. These plants are well adapted to Calgary's weather conditions. They require less water than ornamental plants like petunias or marigolds. And they are all perennials, meaning they come back every year. These are also plants that pollinators like bees and butterflies know to look for. So if we got their food covered by planting native wildflowers, let's talk about water and habitat. So one way to help is to place a small, shallow dish of water outside for pollinators who are thirsty and need a drink. But make sure it has landing platforms like rocks to ensure the pollinators have something flat to stand on and so they don't fall in. There are a lot of different ways we can help native pollinators, and one of the simplest is just giving them space. This space or habitat can be open soil, can be leaf piles, can be dead plant stems and logs. These all allow pollinators to keep sheltered while they're hibernating through the winter. And an easy way to do this is just to not tidy up your garden. That's right, keep a messy garden in the fall. Remember, 70% of our native bees nest in the ground, and the other 30% nest in those natural materials, so the tunnels in the plant stems and the natural spaces. So if you want to give them more homes, you can leave them those natural spaces, and you can also build or buy homes for them to put in your yard or garden, like a bee hotel. Now, the last way you can help our local pollinators is by taking their pictures. That's right, taking their pictures. By documenting the different types of pollinators you see, you can become what we call a citizen scientist, and you can help real pollinator researchers. You can submit your photos to a website such as iNaturalist, or their kids version called Seek, or Bumblebee Watch Canada, where researchers can view them and know what kinds of bees, as well as how many are being found in our city. Local scientists at the University of Calgary are studying the bees in our parks and at places like the Bee Boulevard to find out what types of flowers that they like the most. And the cool thing is that the city of Calgary then uses this information to make sure that we are planting the types of flowers that pollinators like. So you can contribute to this research by recording your sightings, so taking pictures, and submitting them to iNaturalist and the University of Calgary's Calgary Pollinators Project. The more we research, the more that we learn, and our local researchers have found some pretty cool discoveries, including 3 different kinds of endangered bumblebee in our city. These are Bombus bohemicus, Bombus occidentalis, and Bombus terricola, Bombus being a type of bumblebee. That is so cool. Here I have a list of additional resources. These are mentioned throughout our presentation. And the City of Calgary has some pretty amazing online resources, so I recommend you check them out. There's resources on pollinators and naturalization and activities to help these species. This presentation will be available online, but I encourage you to take a screenshot of this slide if you're interested in learning more about our local pollinators and how you can help. I also mentioned that we have more examples of our native wildflowers on the website. We have a really great new wildflower guide, and you can find that at the 3rd link, calgary.ca/yardsmart. We're going to head back over to Chelsea for our wrap up.
Okay. So I think Leah did a really good job of explaining a little bit more about our pollinator friends. But before we say goodbye to you, we really want to make sure that we've come to the same agreement about what these pollinators can do. So first of all, we learned that pollinators in Calgary are mostly solitary, and they mostly don't have hives or sting. And so these pollinators are a lot more gentle than you think they are. And I know a lot of us can be afraid of little things with 6 legs, but these pollinators just want to go around looking for nectar and pollen. They don't really want to bother with us too much. So when we remember that they're more gentle than we think, we can be kinder neighbors to them. They also make a huge amount of our food, a lot of our favorite foods. So about 1 in every 3 food items that people really love to eat came from insect pollinated plants. And so if we love eating fresh fruit, then we know that we really need to love our pollinators too. And even if we don't love fruit, say for some reason we only like to eat bread every day, there's other reasons to love our pollinators too. So most flowering species need pollinators to make new seeds. So if you like flowers, then that's a good reason to like pollinators too. And a lot of our pollinators, even if they're itty bitty, spend the winter in Calgary. And winter can be very cold, and they need special places to overwinter safely. So making sure that we're leaving habitat for them, making sure that they have spots where they can find a hole in the ground or a plant stem to hide in, that's really important for their overwintering ability. And Leah gave us so many ideas about what we could do to help pollinators. So we can plant vegetables or fruits or wildflowers, giving those animals lots of food to eat over the course of the year. We can make sure that they have water to drink, which is really important when we have really hot summers like our last summer was and like this summer is predicted to be. We have the ability to give them shelter, so we can leave leaves on our yard in the fall or loose soil and rocks, hollow plant stems, old logs. Maybe we could even build bee homes. And so we can build structures for them to live in over the course of the winter. And the last idea was really cool. We can take photos of these species and share that information with scientists who can use that to study invertebrates and learn a little bit more about them. So a lot of our pollinator friends, we don't know much about them yet. And so your citizen science, your photos can really help us understand them a little bit better. So my last question of the day is a little bit of a silly one. Who pollinates most of the world's plants and doesn't get any of the credit? A humblebee. Now we have time for some Q&A. Maybe Cody can help us out before we wish you a beautiful day. It is a beautiful day outside. It's really lovely.
Absolutely. Thank you, Leah and Chelsea, and thank you everyone for attending. There are several questions. The Q&A is very, very popular. Also, Barbara Kowalczyk, thank you for your responses to these questions. So, do moths pollinate?
Moths are pollinators. There's so many different kinds of pollinators in Calgary. So exciting. But yes, they are.
Absolutely. Question that came up a few times, are there different kinds of pollen, and do bees prefer different kinds of pollen?
Maybe Leah can help out with that one.
There are lots of different kinds of pollen. Really, every flower has a different kind of pollen, and all those different kinds of bees, like I mentioned, some of them, they have the flowers that they like to go to, and there's others that have different flowers that they like to go to. This is quite often related to the pollen and how that pollen tastes, because as I mentioned, some of our bees like to snack on pollen too. It's a good protein source. And so there are certain bees, like there's a harebell bee that we can find here in Calgary, and they like to eat the pollen from the harebell flowers, and that's pretty much the only flower that they eat the pollen from, because they don't like the taste of the other ones. So thank you for that question.
Great, thanks for your answer. We have a question here. How do I know what kind of pollinator-friendly flower to plant?
Ooh, so those resources that Leah pointed out, maybe we can go back to that slide and take a look. There we go. So there's some information, especially the Calgary.ca websites that have some great plant lists. And Leah actually has some behind her right now in where she's sitting. So I'm going to swap cameras with her. Maybe I'll grab one too. Yeah, so
I've got a paper example here, but we do have this on our website as well. So it's our native wildflower guide, and it's really well done because it's got all these different pictures of different wildflowers that we can find, but it also tells you where you should plant them. So if they need to go in the full sun, or if they need to be in the part shade, or if they need full shade on the back. But there's lots and lots of really great wildflowers that you can plant, and this is all online as well.
Excellent, thank you so much. Another question here. How do I help the 3 kinds of endangered bees? Or how can we help endangered bees?
I think Leah can help us out with this one again.
It's really all those examples that we're talking about, all those things. The biggest thing is getting them their food and their water and their space. So planting all these different wildflowers, which are the food that we know that they like, is one of the best things that we can do. Because as we mentioned, our city is covered in streets and houses and schools, and it isn't just a big wildflower buffet anymore. So the more buffets we can add in our parks, but also at our homes and at our schools, that's going to give these bees the food that they need and the energy that they need, so they can find their nesting spots and they can lay their eggs and they can make more bees. So it's true for our endangered bees, and it's true for all of our other native bees as well.
Excellent, thanks so much. Another question here. Why do bees sting?
That is a really great question. So bees, when they're stinging, it's usually because they're very, very scared. They think that something's going to destroy their hive, or that they're going to get killed, right? Or that they're going to get eaten. And you know that you're not going to eat a bee, right? It's not a very good idea. But the bees don't always know that you're not there to eat them. So giving them space is a good idea. But really, the only time that our solitary bees especially are going to sting is if they're feeling that really big threat. Otherwise, they're happy to go about their feeding or their nesting, as long as we give them the space to do so.
Excellent, thank you. Let's see here. Do bees sink in water? And I think you addressed that earlier with what we can do to help our pollinators.
Yeah, they're not the best swimmers. Not the best swimmers.
And maybe one more question here. How do bees find the pollen or their sources? How do they find that resource?
Oh, that's a great question. So if you're a solitary bee, you're looking out for yourself. You don't have anyone else looking for food for you. If you're in a colony, there's a whole bunch of worker bees who their only job is to look for food all day. So different roles for different groups, but they have special vision. And this is one of the cool superpowers that bees have. They are able to see in ultraviolet light. Now that's really cool. That means that they can see colors that we can't see, and they can see patterns on flower petals that we can't see. And those flower petals kind of give them like directions to where they need to go to be able to find the nectar and the pollen that they want to find. And so it helps the flowers to give good directions to bees, because that helps the flowers make seeds, and it helps the bees because they're able to find their pollen and nectar more easily. So they're looking out with their special bee vision, and they see that bright flower with those perfect directions, and that's how they find the food that they need. But it's a really cool process. Yeah, they have a special vision.
Excellent, thank you. Just a few more questions here. A couple more questions. So how can you tell if a bee is a girl or a queen bee or versus a male bee?
I'll get Leah to answer that one for me. It has to do with the size and shape, but I think she can answer it better than me.
That's a really good question, and it's kind of a hard question to answer because it really depends on the species of bee that you're looking at, because there's so many different species of bee. We've mentioned that there's 300 different kinds of bees here in Calgary, and for each of those bees it's going to look different, but the queen bees tend to be bigger. That's one thing you can look for, and also think of what time of year it is. Remember, those male bees for most species don't live for very long. So if it's kind of the end of summer, you might see some bees that look a little different than the ones you've been seeing all summer long. Those might be your male bees. But again, it really depends on the species.
Excellent, thank you. And last question here, how do you know so much about bees? How did you learn all this stuff about bees?
Oh, that's a funny question. I love it though, because everyone can learn so much about bees. You have such flexible minds, you can learn so much, and whatever you're interested in, you're going to remember. So if you have a passion about something in nature, you're going to be able to learn it faster and remember it better. So really all it takes to learn more things is to care about more things or be curious about more things. And that's something that I find most of my students are really good at. You have that innate curiosity where you want to learn more, and that's how you remember more. So I hope that everyone can learn more about pollinators and bring that excitement to other people, because when we teach other people, that's also a good way to help us learn.
Excellent answer, thank you. And I think that covers most of our questions here.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us and learning a little bit more about bees together with us and some of our other pollinator friends like hummingbirds and moths. I hope you have a beautiful day.